Hi everyone, I'm Dee Abair, State Manager for REA. Welcome to the first episode of our exclusive three-part series, Customers Need Transparency. Today, I'm joined by my co-host, Greg Braun, Senior Market Research Manager at REA. Hi, Greg.
Hey, how you going?
Good, thank you. Good, thank you.
Thanks for that introduction. I'm super excited here to kick off the series today. And hello, everyone. In this exclusive three-part series, Dee and I will be taking a deep dive look into three customer groups. Buyers, you'll all be familiar with, sellers and renters. And really just trying to help you understand why it's important to be transparent with these groups at this time. In this first episode, we'll be focusing on buyers. We'll be looking at how the buyer is evolving, their need for information, the need for transparency, and possibly one of the very few positive outcomes from the pandemic is actually helping shaping real estate.
A lot to cover off, Greg. So let's kick off. Tell me what we're seeing with buyers. You mentioned the word transparency. What are we seeing with buyers and their need for that transparency?
Yeah, great question. So I think, first of all, when we're thinking about buyers, we're thinking about consumers. But we need to really kind of reflect on how their world has changed over the last maybe 10 or 15 or 20 years even. What I am observing and what is very much happening right now is that consumers are becoming experts. They're evolving to become the things that we do in our day-to-day jobs in a way. They're an evolving species, evolved to kind of research and find the information that they're looking for. They don't have to; they actually want to, and this is where the change has really happened. Our property seeker study, which we've just completed at the tail end of last year, really has told us and shone a light on the fact that people are looking for more information than they ever have done before. They're looking at more information sources. They're going farther and wider to find the information that they need. As you can also appreciate, late kind of Gen Ys and Gen Zs, they're even more curious. They're even more kind of self-serving and self-sufficient. And this is really just how they operate. I mentioned the property seeker study. This is a study of 7,000 consumers in Australia. One of the largest, if not the largest piece of research we do with this cohort. Completed in December 2020. Now, this gave us some real insight into what we think buyers, people are looking for when it comes to property information. Anything from kind of macro property trends, mortgage rates, government grants, economic trends, through to the property landscape, suburb, national property metrics, all these things that they want to know about. Personal affordability, how much can they afford? Home loan calculators, expensing, budgeting, and then what does it look like on the other side? So once I've actually bought the property, the post-ownership kind of information, renovation, all of those bits of information they're looking at, they're arming themselves with before they take that next step. So you can see their needs are as long as they are broad. They're arming themselves with all this information before they take that next step.
I'm really keen to understand whether or not they're spending most of their time online.
Yeah, well, I mean, we all are, right? Particularly the last 12 months, I think we've all reflected how much that's possibly increased. But it's it's here to stay. It's one of those things. That's where we go by and large as a default starting point. So online is very much a big part of it. But it's not all about online, particularly with complex decisions like buying property and things like that. You can't just rely on one single source. Often that information isn't just there. So we are often seeing that people will go online, they'll go offline, they'll go back to online to kind of test some of the assumptions or some of the things they've already heard. Offline is actually really trusted. When we think about offline, it's really about word of mouth. It's about asking my friends, my family, my colleagues about their experiences, what they've done, who they've used, and kind of what their story is. And that's one of the most kind of trusted ways that people get information to take their next step. And it's often one that is the biggest influencer on the things that they do. So offline is almost covered. It's almost a certainty of what they're gonna hear from those people is somewhat gospel. They take with it a lot of trust. Online, on the other hand, has has some ground to make up in terms of its trustworthiness. There's so much information. There can be sometimes quite competing and conflicting information. So getting the right information when they need it is really all of our jobs, in this room and on this podcast to get right.
And we know in that journey for a buyer, the agent plays a really important role in that ecosystem. So where do agents fit into this whole process when buyers are kind of in that mode?
Yeah. Well, first of all, they're really important. There is no substitute for the expert agent when they're in part of the journey. I suppose everything I've spoken about now is really thinking about the early part when people are in the research mode. Can I afford? What am I going to buy? Where should I be looking? All of those kind of questions to help paint the picture of what the kind of property buying landscape looks like. However, when they move from research to that kind of search element in their journey, we see that that's where the agent really kind of comes into their own, and that's when consumers are ready to engage. Really good agents are the ones that have already put as much information out there as possible that gives that consumer or that buyer that information before they have to have that conversation. They're already providing, in a sense, that transparency as a kind of a hygiene factor. I talk about hygiene factors, and some people look at me a bit confusing, and going off tangent for a second, imagine you go to a hotel, you're checking in, you book in, you sleep there the night, you shower in the morning, there's no hot water. Hot water is something you expect to be in that hotel. That is a hygiene factor. And I suppose what we're seeing from consumers right now is this idea that there's so much things that they expect to see in a listing or information they can get from that property. And when it's not there, that kind of risks that trust piece, and that really does risk a kind of a sense of transparency. Really great agents, on the other hand, they will be there kind of at the side of the buyer as soon as they start making inquiries, and they'll be prepared to answer the inquiry in a full and complete way. And really that gives an extra sense of kind of confidence and trust and transparency to that buyer that again helps them kind of progress in their journey. Remember now, again, the Property Seeker survey shone a light on the fact that buyers are spending about 7 weeks on average in that exploration stage, that search part of the journey. So you can imagine how much knowledge and expertise in a way that they're acquiring in that time.
7 weeks is actually quite a long time to be in that mode. How do we know if the buyers are generally happy with that information they're getting, given that there's such a mixed array of service coming and information coming from agents? Are they happy with the information they're getting right now?
Happy? Are they happy? Happy is probably an overstatement. I would say that they're probably actually but potentially unhappy. The information they're getting is patchy, I think, at best. And I'm English. Sometimes we mince our words, but I'm going to try not to on this case. But the information is somewhat lacking. It's a systemic problem, I think, in real estate. There's listings just not having all the information in a full and complete way that I think your typical consumer and buyer expect right now. You think about what I said at the start, that people are looking far and wide for as much information as they can get to inform themselves, to make sure that they're making the right decisions to progress in that journey. Absence of that information in a listing, for example, is a data transparency issue. It's something they already expect to be there, and more often than not, there are bits of that information lacking. This leads to a wider concern around trust. Trust in the agent, trust in the industry, and a wider issue around transparency. A couple of stats that may or may not surprise the listeners is really around, and we've been asking the same question for about 5 years now, about when you're thinking about the listing of property generally, what are the things that they often see as things that need fixing because they're not there? What often do they see information that is missing? Lack of price, 74% of buyers say lack of price is one of their biggest frustrations. No floor plan, 57%. Inaccurate price range, 50%. Poor quality photos, 42%. Now, I don't want to rattle off a whole bunch of stats, although I just have, but I think it's really quite, it paints quite an interesting picture about the amount of information that people expect to be there, and it's really frustrating that it's not. Why is this important? is a great question. People are buying and selling houses, and the world continues. But I think what we are seeing is that people that often don't get that information can do a couple of things that actually have quite negative business impacts. One of which is actually just skip over that property. And another one is prioritize other properties that do have prices given. Of course, from an agent perspective, you'll never see this, because if they're skipping over your property or prioritizing another property, you'll never see it. So you'll never know how bad the problem is. And I hope this kind of just sheds some light on what's actually going on behind the scenes.
That's phenomenal. That can be the outcome just by not presenting the properties in the right way for the buyer. Do you think over the last 5 years, since we've certainly been talking to the industry about improving this information, do you think we've seen some improvements in this area?
I mean, the data kind of suggests that there may have been some improvements across some of these, but generally speaking, it's the same things that are coming out time and time again as being kind of the big things that are most frustrating to our consumers. So whilst the numbers might not be as severe or they jump around, it's still, price, floor plan, inaccurate price range, poor quality photo. They all exist in the top 5 things. Where they exist kind of shifts around a bit, but fundamentally, it does feel a very similar picture to where we were 5 years ago. However, there have been some silver linings. I mentioned at the start how kind of a pandemic has actually brought around some element of change to real estate. Now, it really is around, and it's not just real estate, it's really around kind of how consumers have adopted certain technologies that they're already in the midst of adopting anyway. But what we're seeing is that that adoption has just been fast-tracked. Digital inspections is a great example of that, whereby we're just seeing that, it's taken the place of photos, essentially, that were quite static, quite curated to show a particular view of a property that a buyer was interested in. But actually, what digital inspections do is give a whole new dynamic, sort of panoramic view, if you like, of the property that they're interested in. And it's another great example of kind of where transparency or injecting transparency into an area of property decision making amongst buyers that wasn't there, or was certainly not in such used in such a prominent way. With digital inspections, we've done some research on this as well, and it's super fascinating in terms of what consumers and buyers see as the kind of biggest benefits of them. But really, it's around the obvious things. But obvious is good, right? It's clearer sense of the property layout. It's a clearer sense of the size and the space of that property, a clearer sense of the property condition, and they also have benefits for the agent. It makes the agent seem kind of more of a kind of professional offering, I suppose. And from an agency, it does actually seem to increase the premiumness, or the perception of premiumness, amongst the agency, amongst buyers. It gives them more confidence that listing is complete, and actually it helps them make that next step into property buying. So it's really fascinating how, a pandemic has brought around fast tracking of something we're already doing, but that fast tracking means that more people are able to make better decisions with more and transparent information amongst, at their fingertips.
So fascinating. What would you say to agents listening today? What are the top 3 things you would tell them to consider when they're looking at this issue of transparency? How can they better engage with their buyers?
Yeah, I would say probably 3 things at the moment. Fairly high level, but I think, there's a lot to unpack in these, but I think it's definitely an exercise worth doing. But number 1 is probably just giving the buyers the information that they expect. We've already spoken about how in the last 5 years, things haven't perhaps progressed as well as we would hope. And, giving information up freely, willingly, that's full, complete and accurate, that's really at the heart of transparency. It will reduce your customers' frustrations and essentially increase their levels of trust in you. It's a long-term game. What I've always found interesting, and Dee, you might have a view, is that I think there's a real opportunity amongst amongst real estate agents to actually own this space of being the ones that give up all the information. And I feel like, in a world where we're all perhaps fed misinformation, becoming a bit more wary about some of the things that we are fed online, it feels like a real opportunity. I digress. Number 2, thinking about the tech at our disposal that can really help tell the story and do the job for us. Digital inspections we spoke about at some length, but that's a really great tool that can increase someone's ability to look, to see, and to decide for themselves there and then if that's got potential to progress the next steps and really increase transparency. And then taking your time to understand your buyer and preempting the information that is relevant to their unique situation. And don't forget as well, they're going to be so well versed in a lot of that information, but they will come to you when they need you to be, to play that expert role. But don't assume that they don't know anything because they've had that 7 weeks to be swatting up behind the scenes.
It was really fascinating and great to unpack the data with you. And I think we can all agree that you've given us a really good insight into buyers and what they're after. If, of course, you want more information, you can download a PDF from our Agent Marketing Centre that looks into the data we've touched on today. That does bring us to the end of our first episode. Thank you so much to our listeners for tuning in. I hope it's given you some insight into why it's so important to be transparent with your buyers and how you can better support the needs of those buyers with relevant information. We will be back with 2 more episodes where we'll next look at sellers and then renters in more detail. In the meantime, if you'd like to know more about your customers, head to the Agent Marketing Centre online where you can download more information.